No.
Okay, and we're live. Hello everybody, and welcome to OEG's latest webinar. It's a sunny day here in the UK. How long that'll last, who knows? But let's hope the sun's shining wherever you're joining us from. Today we're going to look at Southeast Asia. Fascinating market with lots of opportunity for growth and lots of things happening. We'll attempt to do that justice in the next hour or so. To do that, we've lined up a really interesting panel of speakers to help us just unpick what's going on in the market. Delighted to be joined by Mark Suter, who is the Chief Airline Marketing Officer at Abowitz Cebu Airport. Mark has been on our wish list to join us on a webinar for a while, so we're delighted to have you, Mark, and looking forward to engaging with you about what's happening in your part of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and welcome.
Afternoon. Thank you.
We're also joined by a return speaker, Hannah Pearson. Hannah's director at Pear Anderson, who are KL-based sales and market intelligence agency who focus on Southeast Asia and the tourism industry in particular. So Hannah regularly talks in the market about what's happening in terms of tourism trends. So who better to help us unpick what's happening in your part of the world. Welcome back, Hannah.
Thank you for having me.
And last but by no means least, John, welcome back. How are you today?
All right, looking forward to this. There's so much to talk about, and it changes as soon as you sort of look at the internet. It's incredible what's happening.
I guess that's the lasting thing that has sort of happened, isn't it? That, you know, we're now, it sort of feels like we're on a 24-hour news cycle, and the news changes every hour, every half hour. So
yeah, absolutely.
We prepared the slide deck earlier this week. If it's out of date, then you know, I'm sure we'll fill in the blanks. Okay, well, let's jump in then. So today we are here to talk about, as I said, Southeast Asia, and we want to just look at some capacity growth trends across the major markets and how airlines are adjusting their networks. We can't not talk about how resilient this market is in the face of disruption, because there's major disruption happening, major changes. I thought it also would be good just to look at where will growth come and what might that look like. So hopefully we'll have time to get to that. We'll start where we usually do, taking a look at the global position on capacity. So for those of you joining us for the first time, we tend to do this every month. We take a look at trends and what's happening. What we've got on the chart on the left here is global capacity. We've just got going back to 2024 here. Here's the 2025 line, and then the yellow line is 2026 as was scheduled as of February, and then the dotted orange line, just for further insights, is what the schedule is currently showing. So you can see there's a little bit of impact, obviously, with what's happening at the moment in the Middle East. But actually, you know, and that runs through to April, possibly into May, which is what we're hearing in terms of what airlines are saying about the position. The reality is none of us really know how long the conflict is going to continue for, and indeed what the wider impact will be. But in terms of the forward schedule, it's looking fairly like we thought it should look for the rest of the summer.
I think Deirdre, airlines, this is never good news for airlines, but at the moment the best they can do is plan to the end of May or the end of June, which is why you see those two lines being pretty even at this moment in time. Yeah. And I know we've got a slide on it later. And what's happening is not good news for the airline industry. And it's certainly not going to be good news for travellers if you've not bought your airfare in the last couple of weeks, because fares are going to increase, no doubt about that. But the Middle East is only a small part of the overall aviation industry. And it's a crucially, vitally important gateway hub between Europe and Asia and Australasia and Africa and China and other such points. But, it's got to be kept into context. And for the airlines and the staff who are concerned, who are involved in it, it's not a nice situation at all. But it is a relatively small share of global capacity. But the impact is not just necessarily in the Middle East. It's about the impact on the price of fuel, the supply of fuel, and airlines, as we know, already relocating aircraft out of the Middle East to sunnier climates where they can be assured of the safety of the aircraft.
I think it's that ripple effect, isn't it, in terms of the knock-on impact in any period of disruption, whether it's a major weather event or geopolitical situation or conflict. The economy globally is so interconnected that actually there's always going to be a consequence in some or other part of the world, and that's what we're starting to sort of see manifest, I guess, in certain markets. So the chart on the right, similar profile. We just wanted to show global international capacity, as obviously that's where we're seeing that impact of the Middle East connecting market. And you've got a sort of added, when looking at March and April, you've always got the slight complication of Easter, which falls in.
Is that when you get chocolate and eggs?
So, some people do.
Oh, right.
Some people do.
Sure.
Hot cross buns, probably a better option. That's quite a niche reference, but there we are.
I think one of the interesting things is, we're talking about the ripple here, and we were saying earlier, if you look at the US market, Scott Kirby at United Airlines said yesterday, airfares could increase by up to 20% if this becomes a prolonged event. And demand will not tolerate a 20% increase in airfares. So you have a US domestic market that had a fair reliance on European inbound connecting traffic going down to Florida and other points in the US through all of the gateways. That's down 10, 15% from some markets in Europe because of what's happened in the last 15, 16 months and consumer sentiment towards the US. And then on top of that, the US domestic market tanks, then hotels in Florida, the whole travel ecosystem is going to be desperate for travelers. That's thousands of miles away from where this event is occurring. Yeah.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? That actually, I guess the kind of fragility of markets in terms of their ability to stimulate demand through pricing becomes limited in an environment where everything's costing more.
Yeah,
and we were kind of already wrestling with that, weren't we, in the industry, in terms of the cost of living and the cost of everything has increased significantly. So.
Yeah, and the supreme irony here is that US airlines typically do not hedge. So they are some of the first to be impacted by this. So at one end you have American and United, who are going to be, pretty badly damaged by this if it continues for a long time. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you have Delta Airlines, who own an oil well and can pump the stuff out of the ground as fast as they want. It's a strange set of circumstances we're living with.
Yeah. Okay. Just a little overview then of what we've been talking about. So as John said, in capacity terms, the Middle East, and this is just looking at global capacity by global regions, only 5% of capacity globally and you can see how capacity by country sort of stretches across the key markets where the bulk of capacity is in the Middle East, and then some of the smaller regional markets. I think what that doesn't tell you, it's only one part of the story, really, is that there's a significant, and I'm going to skip on to the next slide. What is really significant is the connecting flows that actually are facilitated over these big airports in the Middle East. So, and we've just chosen in this snapshot to look at 3 hubs in the region. So Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. They handled around 180 million passengers in 2025. And what you can see here is that a significant proportion for all 3 of these airports of traffic was not just starting or ending their journey in the Middle East. They were connecting, using the Middle East for what these hubs have evolved to be as very effective connecting points between Asia and Europe, Asia and North America, Europe and the Southwest Pacific. We talked about that in a deep dive into Australia a couple of weeks ago. So I think when we start to think about the ripple effect and the consequence for other parts of the world, it's about understanding the ability of some of these source markets or origin markets to provide alternatives. So if there were 100 million there or thereabouts people connecting over just these 3 hubs to other destinations, if we look at that just for Asia to Europe, and that's the sort of widest part of all the different parts of Asia, 40 million passengers, that's a lot of connections that who else in the market could, we've seen announcements from some airlines putting on which were potentially planned anyway. We've seen some tactical responses to the situation.
Yeah, but they're short term. They can't. Yeah. There is no airline in the world who's sitting around with a fleet of A350s or 777s wondering what to do with them. They are all fully utilised. They're all scheduled, and there's some downtime that they're taking advantage of. And Singapore Airlines are doing that with additional Gatwick services through the summer. They're upgrading the aircraft on Melbourne to a 380. And they've announced Sydney West. Now, I don't know why they're doing that again, because they announced that last year. So that's just freeloading PR. And you've got, other carriers who are trying to add a bit of capacity here and there. But no one's got masses of capacity, or indeed even access to slots that would allow them to get into these markets and make something happen. And of your 40 million, I think the really fascinating part is, if you look at both Doha and Dubai, they had created connections from secondary and even some tier 3 cities in Europe through their hubs. That's not going to be replicated. That's, finding another option from a small city in Europe is virtually impossible. So, the demand gravitates back to London, Paris, Frankfurt, Zurich, wherever it happens to be. And that's going to take a bit of time to recover. So I think it's, people are going to have to get a train and get to London or to Paris if they want to fly, rather than go through their own airport. It's fascinating. I mean, Mark, what's your Middle East capacity like now compared to pre-event?
Well, interestingly, John, the Emirates daily service that we have here actually restarted about a week ago. So we're one of the lucky few that are part of this. I think 40% capacity that DXB is currently operating. So our service is pretty much full coming, but not so full going back. But the Qatar service that we have, that hasn't operated now for almost a month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're obviously, they feel a bit more vulnerable and a bit closer to the action, so to speak, and they move the aircraft out.
And that's been a bit of an issue for us here, just because we have there's a lot of overseas Filipino workers, particularly in the Middle East. So, because they're on rotation, they typically will work, an annual contract or whatever, and then they do their annual leave. It's been difficult actually repatriating some of the the overseas workers from here. So that's actually been quite a challenge, I think, just generally for the country here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Hannah, what about in KL? Obviously, you got Malaysia Airlines with their non-stop Heathrow service. Any noticeable increase in selling fares?
I mean, definitely. I was talking to an agent yesterday and they were telling me the going rate from KL to London in economy was 15,000 ringgit, and before it might be 3,000 ringgit.
Wow.
So we're talking about 5 times.
And I think £3,000 for an economy return ticket.
Yeah.
I think
So
you had the pain of
the
a high fare as well, didn't you, Hannah, to get back? You were
Exactly. Yeah, I was meant to be flying back from with Emirates after ITB Berlin, and had to buy a one-way London to KL with Malaysia Airlines, £1,000 one way. So it was.
So have they changed the films on board or upgraded the catering for that £1,000?
No discernible difference, John.
No discernible.
Unfortunately,
It was that good.
It was that good.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, that is the issue, I think. And we're seeing a lot of, of course, there's a lot of group travel out from Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Now is really, or was a key time. You had Eid, so that's a really peak outbound time. You're coming towards Philippines with Easter. You've got Songkran in Thailand, and a lot of these groups would be using Middle East airfares because they were cheaper to get to Europe. And to your point, John, to these secondary and tertiary cities as well, because it makes the tours more interesting. And so now they're kind of either scrambling to figure out, how do we reroute this? Do we find an alternate? Do we go with Turkish, for example? But if the fares are too high, what do you do? So they're a little bit stuck right now, a lot of agents trying to figure out.
I do wonder if this will mark, and I know geographically there are sort of differences in how people use travel agents, but I do wonder whether this will mark a sort of turning point for people to go back to using agents to help them. You've only got to get stuck once somewhere when you've booked yourself a fantastic itinerary and agenda, which is how lots of people travel now. To then have the benefit of hindsight in terms of the value of a good agent that can navigate all of that.
For every press inquiry OAG's had, they've all been about what are the options, how can we do this, what's going to happen to airfares. And it's just the principles of supply and demand, isn't it? I mean, it's absolutely going to get more expensive.
Yeah, I think that was always historically the benefit of going to a traditional travel agent, wasn't it? In times of crisis, where you need instant assistance, that's actually where they bring their value, isn't it? So in certain markets, even here in the Philippines, typically people will still use traditional agents, albeit a lot now is moving online, but traditional agents still are quite dominant here.
Yeah, and I mean Edward Clayton, who's been on before, has just message that his son went via Kazakhstan over China and Russia, and the flight was a third full. I mean, there are options out there. You don't quite take your life in your own hands.
And it's this, isn't it? It's the map. The map kind of isn't changing in terms of the routings that are taking place. And I think interesting, and we just picked this up from Flight Radar a couple of days ago, but in terms of that position that you were talking about for the Philippines, Mark, the kind of potential recovery of where carriers are in their respective positions sort of illustrates that. I think and we talked about this at the start, didn't we? The volatility. I was weighing up whether should we show just the last week in oil prices, because that's an interesting story in itself, or this is a much longer time series, obviously going back to the highs in 2022 when we were coming out of the crisis. But it's really this is the one of the biggest factors, isn't it, in terms of
it is. I mean, Emirates apparently plan to operate a near full schedule next week, which will be interesting. So that airlines are trying to get back. I think the other frustrating things for the airline sector is, when the pandemic occurred, at least there was this sort of, okay, well, we're going to shut down for at least this period of time. Here, there is uncertainty about how long that is going to be.
Yeah.
So, do you furlough crew? Do you take your aircraft to Spain? Can you bring forward some engineering requirements that were further down the line? Can they be done now? You're in sort of like suspended animation, waiting for someone to move so you can get on with things.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? And you've got this situation where that we were talking about before we came on, where actually the consequence of oil prices ripples through not just to airfares and air travel, but it's the on the ground piece as well, isn't it? In terms of Hannah, you were telling me that there are some concerns about the ground transport options for people undertaking tours in Thailand, which, when you think about, the key difference with COVID was that nobody was going anywhere. Nobody was trying to still maintain an operation of whatever that business was, whether it was a tour operator or somebody running a car service in a key tourism destination. So I think that's the different dimension, isn't it? That we're sort of there are some factors that are having a significant impact, and we're still in some markets trying to have business as usual, and that tension's gonna spill over, isn't it, soon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's moving from, you've got all of these different factors if you're a traveler. So one, can you actually get there if you're meant to be flying the Middle East? Okay, I can get there. Or is the fare going to be really high? Yeah, it's really high. And now I'm there. Is there fuel there? Can I actually get around? Can I do the tour as I was meant to? And I know Mark probably knows this better than anyone, with Philippines declaring this fuel emergency in the Philippines, right, Mark?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I think yesterday there was a national emergency for energy sort of decreed, which effectively just means, emergency budgets are opened up. And I think it just essentially gives the government more flexibility to look at alternative, let's say, supply routes for oil, particularly as we were saying before we started that, traditionally a lot of the oil does, particularly jet fuel, comes out of the Straits of Hormuz for the Asian markets. So yeah, I think here, there's about a month's supply of oil, as we're told, and I think now all governments, particularly here, that aren't necessarily drilling their own, are now looking at alternative sources. So yeah, definitely will be interesting to see how that plays out and at what price.
Absolutely. Yeah, interesting. Okay, let's bring it back to the slide deck. I wanted to just, because the kind of obvious question is, beyond those sort of things that are happening, what does it mean for Southeast Asia? Hannah, you were quite quick off the mark when this all happened, and you launched a survey along with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Tourism Associations. I think I've got that right. ASEANTA, and you released that yesterday. It'd be great if you could just talk us through some of the key findings in that survey.
Sure. I mean, so yeah, we launched the survey about 1 week after. So I would think that this doesn't quite capture, because at that point I hadn't even really reflected on what the impact of just fuel shortages in general would be on the region. So it doesn't quite capture that aspect of it. But in general, 48% of Southeast Asian travel businesses said the prospects for their business in Q2 are worse than they had expected. I mean, that's not rocket science, right? I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But I think what was interesting is asking them for the outbound travel, where might that travel be redirected? Unsurprisingly, majority think towards Southeast Asia, East Asia, and those two, I mean, as we know, intra-Asian travel accounts for the largest arrivals source market in Asia. So that's not a surprise, but that Europe was still in there, Central and South Asia was still in there. Surprised me a bit, because it kind of signals like if they have the routes to get there, they're going to continue going there. For those, it's more a logistics thing.
Yeah.
But in general, there was definitely some pessimism and some optimism, saying, okay, maybe this is an opportunity for new transit hubs. To your point, John, that might not be quite realistic, right? Maybe in the short term, we might see some interesting new routes. But it's a lot of wait and see, I think.
Yeah, I think, and it sort of is that point, isn't it, that we were making about when you don't know how long the situation's going to last, at what point do you, and we saw this in the pandemic, that people live on a sort of 4 to 6 week planning cycle, 3 months at best. And it's hard to then, at what point do you make some strategic decisions about what the next 6 months might bring, or what the next year might bring. And that's kind of where we are, isn't it? So I think actually to see that the Gulf carriers are to some extent up and running, Emirates in particular, is kind of testament to their ability to just roll with uncertainty and try and restart the operation.
Hannah, what do you think of the travellers' sentiment towards those three big hubs? If they were once again reopened and functioning as normal, would the traveller just go back to their default?
It's hard to say. I mean, I just had in my work WhatsApp chat, somebody just shared a Philippines tour group was just transiting via Emirates today, via Dubai. So they've gone. I think different markets will react differently. Singapore market traditionally is a lot more reserved, a lot more safety conscious. Yeah. Markets like Indonesia tend to be a little bit easier going, let's say.
During the pandemic, they've learned to live with local airlines, so you have to have an easy go approach.
Yeah, I mean, and even during the pandemic, Indonesians would still travel out to Dubai, to all of these places, whereas Singaporeans very much stayed at home. So I think that yes, they're safety conscious. I think we will see different markets developing, and but ultimately, if there is a price crunch, but travelers still want to travel, and the Middle Eastern airlines are back open again and offering very good routes and very good fares, that might swing it.
I suspect it will not just be very good fares. It will be very attractive stopover products, packages, 2 nights on us type sort of thing to reignite the market. So yeah, it'll be fascinating to see at what price travellers are back into stopping in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting times. Okay, let's take a look now then. We said we were going to look at capacity trends in Southeast Asia. So kind of illustrating your point, Hannah, about the reliance on the rest of Asia. This is just looking at Southeast Asia capacity by region, and we split it into 2 charts just so that we can see some of the smaller markets. So 2/3 of capacity in Southeast Asia operates within the region and to Northeast Asia. And you can see sort of similar market sizes. Both have seen strong year-on-year growth. The only reason, this is just looking at March as a snapshot, the only reason we're including 2019, I feel the need to explain that, is because actually we're still seeing in the Northeast Asian market from Southeast Asia a behind 2019 position. So part of the reason I think for strong growth there is that there's still recovery, if we can call it that, 6 years on, happening in that particular geography. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about that in a minute. But strong growth happening for capacity within the region. And then looking across, if we sort of set aside the Middle East, obviously, because of what's currently going on, but if we look across capacity to other regions, pretty punchy growth right across, which I guess sort of underpins what you were saying, Hannah, in terms of, the appetite to travel to Central Asia, although very small, Europe. These are strong rates of capacity growth across these markets, and there's strong demands still there. And we know from, if you look at South Pacific, the outbound Australia international market is really strong at the minute as well, and I think that's driving growth into a number of ASEAN markets. So yeah, so some interesting headlines here, I think.
I think the fascinating thing is, notwithstanding what we're seeing at the moment, does the market require these levels of capacity growth that we're seeing? I.e., is demand strong enough to support this growth? And obviously in Australia, we know from last week when we were holding a webinar, there's a lot of interest and outbound demand from Australia at the moment. But from Europe, that's a punchy capacity growth that we're seeing at the moment compared to last year, and some of that is, airlines taking slots before they sort of get exhausted at some premium airports in Europe. But there's a lot of secondary cities being served as well, or were beginning to be served. So it'll be fascinating to see if that holds. Mark, you're out of range for a non-stop to Europe, aren't you? Just about.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we're right on the edge, but generally most of our traffic here will come through from Europe, at least anyway. Will inevitably come through either the Middle East or places like Changi or Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
And actually, with those airlines, I think Hannah was touching on earlier on, the loads that we're seeing here, particularly through Hong Kong and Singapore to Europe, are very, very strong. It's quite clear that they are doing a very good job where they can of absorbing the excess demand. And I think that we're expecting that to continue certainly in the next few months ahead. Not just here at Cebu, but I think in the Philippines generally. And interestingly, going back to Hannah's point, I think what the sentiment is if it was to all switch back on again in the coming days or weeks. I think generally it's very much country specific. So I think the Filipinos will probably be more relaxed about trying through the Middle East, predominantly because a lot of them are working there anyway. But I think there are other markets such as Korea or Japan where definitely they are more sort of conservative when it comes to safety and security perhaps, and will definitely avoid and or not travel full stop.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And if I can add, Deirdre, to you were talking about recovery and 20, and whether we can still talk about 2019. Right? But I mean, for Southeast Asia, it is still, although unbelievably, but it is for Southeast Asia. It is still. I mean, if we're talking about international arrivals, I was checking just before this. So last year it was 129 million international arrivals. 2019 was 139. So we're still not there yet. Like hardly any. Only Vietnam and Malaysia have reached back to where they were back in 2019. Philippines is still miles behind.
That's right. Yeah.
Singapore. Thailand is a whole China story, isn't it? I mean, you could run a webinar on Thailand, China for a long time on what's going on there. And interestingly, there doesn't seem to have been any change in demand or additional capacity from China to Thailand in the last few weeks, which you'd thought that might be perceived as a safe destination for tourists.
Yeah, I think we did see. I didn't mean to go to the slide deck there. I think we did see a bit of that, John, when there definitely was a bit of switching from China, Japan to Thailand. So China to Thailand instead of Japan.
Yeah, there was.
And I wonder whether that has kind of then exhausted any opportunity to do anything more in terms of capacity uplift. And I guess the the kind of unknown then is actually how has that capacity been utilised? Is demand holding up? Or will sentiment to travel internationally be affected? You know, is that another factor that we're going to see play out again? Hard to know at this point, isn't it? I think on domestic, I just wanted to show the importance of the domestic markets across the region as well. And there are still, so this is just for the main country markets across Southeast Asia, domestic capacity this summer season versus last summer season. Super strong growth in the Philippines, Mark. So you can maybe tell us what's happening there. But yeah, real positive across some markets, Vietnam and Malaysia, and not so much.
Yeah, so I think here in the Philippines, there's a number of things going on. I think if you remember, if you think about it, the Philippines is an archipelago, so there's over 7,000 islands, and quite a number of the larger islands have airports, right? So, generally now, aviation is starting to replace more and more, traditional means of getting around, which used to have been, covered by ferry. So, I think anecdotally, you will still, see and meet people who are taking a flight for the first time, because previously that, they may have taken a ferry, into Ireland, right? So there's a lot of that going on. And I think also particularly at Manila, you're seeing a lot of increase in gauge. So a lot of domestic routes, certainly here we're benefiting from that as well, are now being operated by wide-body aircraft. So, that's also adding in quite a bit of capacity domestically. So, here in Cebu, on a very peak day, we can have up to 40 flights between Cebu and Manila, of which maybe 4 or 5 are operated by wide-body aircraft, which you wouldn't have necessarily seen last year.
Yeah, wow.
I guess, playing devil's advocate here, these are punchy rates of growth.
Mm-hmm.
Are they profitable rates of growth for the airline industry? Or is this just chasing cash and cash flow? Because, Indonesia has a pretty good record of boom and bust. And we're only talking about 5%. But are they going to deliver those levels of capacity growth? Particularly in light of increasing airfares, supply of fuel. Vietnam, we know, has cut domestic flights quite significantly already. Is that going to happen elsewhere? So that the principle of supply and demand kicks in and the airfare is that high because that's the last seat available type thing. Are we reaching for the next couple of months, are we over egging supply and the dangers that will have?
Yeah, I mean, I think for here, certainly in the Philippines, we would expect the demand, or rather the supply, to be filled by the demand. And I think we've got an Easter break coming up, then followed by school holidays. So I think here for the next 2 to 3 months, certainly we're expecting to continue trading as normal. I think thereafter it becomes more of a crystal ball moment, but you've got to put that in the context as well of some of the ASEAN countries, particularly here in the Philippines. The economies, notwithstanding what's going on, are still growing at very high rates. So here in the Philippines, annual GDP is still around the 6% mark. So that is driving quite a lot of demand year on year for air travel, essentially.
And I think that's the reality, isn't it? That all of the projections for the region are that, by the 2040s, the market's going to have tripled in size, because that sustained level of, across the region, just over 5%, I think. But for some markets, it's higher. And it is just this continued young population, growing disposable income that's driving that change.
And then you look at Manila, and it's already capacity constrained. Clark is already very, very busy. New airport's a couple of years delayed, isn't it, Mark? I mean,
yeah, and
it's going to be the challenge.
yeah, and I think you mentioned it there, Deirdre, as well. The populations here, and I think if you look at Indonesia, 250 million plus here, 115 million in the Philippines, of which you just mentioned. A very high proportion are the younger generation who will be looking to travel. They're just starting out. But you're absolutely right, John. The challenge, I think, will be capacity. Certainly here in the Philippines, Manila is well over its capacity, has been for a number of years. Yes, there's new developments in the pipeline, but they will take time.
Yeah,
I mean, and then you've potentially got in the mix later on, for Vietnam, for example, if they manage to build the high-speed railway, right, linking Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. So you've potentially got high-speed rail, perhaps, coming in and disrupting some of these major domestic routes too.
That's
longer term.
There's a risk of that in Indonesia as well.
Yep.
I think it's an interesting one, because what we've seen in some markets is in Europe, for example, Spain's the kind of classic example, and the London-Paris market massively impacted by the introduction of high-speed rail. In other markets, they coexist. China has a super extensive high-speed rail market now. Japan obviously has significant high-speed rail. And yet, in both those places, the domestic markets are air markets continue to thrive. So, I think, relative to the population and the rate of growth and all of that sort of stuff. But Japan's air market is much more mature, both in terms of the age profile of travellers and everything else.
There was an interesting interview with one of the senior network planners in Japan Airlines a couple of months ago, who was saying their next fleet order for domestic use will be around narrow-bodied aircraft rather than the wide-bodied aircraft. And Deirdre, we sat on an A350, domestic flight in Japan, and it was virtually empty. So, being a bit more sensible about right-sizing fleet to demand. The size of the domestic air market doesn't grow, but as you say, we're still talking millions of people per annum.
But I think back to we're kind of flicking around here in terms of the order of the slide deck, but just looking at the Philippines, you've had this, and we just went back to 2000. You have had this just steady growth, 5.9% year after year after year. And yes, there have been sort of bumps in the road when we had significant LCC expansion in the early part of the 2010s. But growth has kind of continued on. Yes, it's taken a little bit of time to come back, and you've still got challenges there. But the really interesting piece is, if we project forward 25 years, what does the line look like? And it just is underpinned, as you said, Mark, by this young population who, increasingly will want to travel and explore both internally within the Philippines and beyond.
It's an interesting story, because on the global radar, the Philippines hasn't got much attention, has it? It's a big market in its own right, and yet it doesn't command the amount of analytics, comment, insight that perhaps other markets do.
Maybe that's a very Western perspective. Hannah and Mark might tell us something totally different.
To a certain extent, I can understand where John is coming from. I think certainly if you look at tourism development, then it is recognized that the Philippines, certainly coming out of the pandemic, has fallen behind. We can see that in the numbers, and I think Hannah even referenced it. We're here in the Philippines, we're not back to pre-pandemic levels, not quite anyway. And despite attempts to sort of grow that, I think other countries have done a better job within the ASEAN area. So Vietnam and Thailand in particular. And I think certainly the Philippines probably hasn't really beaten its drum, so to speak, loudly enough in the last few years, and has sort of found itself, in the shadows of the Thailands and the Vietnams of this world. And I think, part of it probably as well links back to connectivity, because when you look at connectivity, that there's still a way to go, for the Philippines, and it's not helped by obviously Manila being completely out of capacity, and new capacity for the capital region, at least anyway, will is still a few years away. And I think certainly here in Cebu, we're sort of positioning ourselves as almost an alternative gateway, particularly if you're focused on tourism, because there isn't necessarily a need to go to Manila if you want to go and sit on a beach resort, or go surfing somewhere. And I think when you look at the chart as well that you had there, Deirdre, of Philippines capacity, I mean, it's interesting because just a couple of weeks ago, Cebu Pacific celebrated its 30th anniversary, and I think a lot of that growth has literally come from the low cost carrier capacity entering the market, which as we all know has worked well in stimulating people to aviation, particularly moving them here in the Philippines from ferries onto aircraft.
Yeah, I think on that particular slide, we split it by domestic, international, but I added the stats. So by 2026, I think the low cost share of the total market is 61%, which is actually kind of characteristic of Southeast Asia. If we looked across various country markets, we would see that it's the region in the world with the greatest degree of LCC penetration, and it continues to drive growth, doesn't it? That's if you look at aircraft orders across the region, which we haven't included in this deck, but the big orders are across the carriers in the region. Indonesia, which has got significant the Lion Air Group have got 400.
Yeah, over 100 aircraft.
Yeah, AirAsia got considerable order book as well. So it's not a surprise that will continue. I suppose the question is, how do we see that go even higher in terms of the LCC penetration into the market, and then how does that, what we've seen in in the region as well as in other parts, is the kind of hybridization of low cost. So the product starts to look a little bit different. It's not just low cost in the kind of classic way we would perhaps have thought of it. And then does the playing field level in terms of the kind of competitive position between mainline carriers and LCCs? Again, probably a subject for another day, but kind of interesting perspective to see how that evolves as more and more people travel.
And right. I think just in general, yeah, for the Philippines, if you're thinking about the inbound tourism mix, it's quite different to its ASEAN peers. So Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia have lots of cross-border traffic. You get lots of flows between these countries to one another. Yeah. Actually, I think the share of ASEAN arrivals to the Philippines is a lot lower, and they have different profiles. They have a lot more from East Asia, like you're saying, Deirdre, and Mark, from Japan, from Korea. They have a lot more US arrivals than most of the other countries in Southeast Asia as well, just because of that. So it's a very different mix that makes it hard to do like a like-for-like comparison between Philippines to other countries in Southeast Asia. It's not quite the same.
It's true. We're very here, at least in Cebu, we're in terms of inbound tourism, very dominated by the likes of Korea, Japan, Taiwan. Those are really our core inbound markets for tourism. Yeah.
Leading nicely into, I was going to show a domestic slide there, but leading nicely into my slide that actually just really, really illustrates that. And I think when we talk about the wider Philippines market internationally not having got back to those previous levels. When you look at the dominance that Northeast Asia has in terms of your international markets at country level, five of the top 10 are Northeast Asia, and you've got some significant gaps still in terms of China, for example, still 50% behind where it was. Hong Kong's sort of improved. South Korea, 73% of 2019. So that's really the lag, isn't it? That's where you hope, I guess, from a Philippines Tourist Board perspective, that these markets will return. The wider question, I guess, is have they, are they not traveling, or have they gone elsewhere? Are there other markets that have recognized the need and the importance to cater to a broader audience? And overlaying that, I guess, with the capacity constraints that exist in Manila, it's a challenging dynamic to manage, isn't it? So, do you want growth at all costs, or do you pursue specific target markets and accept that volume maybe isn't the answer?
It's interesting in the case of Japan. It's one of the few international markets in the world that is static at best, if not slightly in decline. So even growing that is always going to be a challenge because of the characteristics of the market. Equally, South Korea, as we know, is a rapidly growing market with an appetite for international travel. I can't believe Gary Bowerman's listening. He's obviously got nothing better to do. I'll try and find some tips, but he makes a valid point that a lot of the growth in the market is all in specific high value segments, and it's really, really concentrated. The wealthy are extremely wealthy, and there is some growth in that wealthy community, but it's not broadly across all segments.
Yeah. I think here it's a really good point. It's a really good point, John, because
it's Gary's point, which was even more surprising, Mark.
Yeah, Gary's right. Actually, I think it's very pronounced here because whilst there is a very young population, I think the levels of wealth are quite they're not let's say evenly spread. And I think actually the Philippines in particular has another quirk because a lot of the national income is actually generated by the OFWs, the overseas Filipino workers, who are literally they're sending money back here. So there's quite a large chunk of the economy is reliant on those very OFWs who are working overseas. So that skews things a little bit here as well.
And I guess there's in the context of the wider ripple effect on people who are working in the Middle East region, people who are working in tourism related industries where there might be a downturn in the market. That's a concern, isn't it, in terms of that sort of props up of the economy.
I mean, it's a huge issue certainly here in Cebu, which is predominantly a leisure-based market. With here we have strong connectivity to a lot of the islands, the resorts, but there is a big push here in the Philippines to recover, to grow tourism, and essentially to try and win back market share that may have been lost to Thailand, Vietnam in particular. And it comes at a particularly bad time because a large chunk of the economy is also reliant on tourism income, of course.
On that, I think the other thing I wanted to show, slightly conscious we've got about 5 minutes left, was the extent to which, so this is just international capacity now for the summer season, looking across the main markets in the region, and there's a positive story overall. Everybody is growing, but there's faster growth happening in some markets versus others. Yeah. So Philippines almost 10%, Vietnam approaching that, Malaysia, and that's being driven by growth within Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia. So I think this is it's really interesting, isn't it, from a perspective. Hannah, we've talked in the past about, you know, how respective countries have positioned themselves, and what markets they're going after, and how that's now kind of manifesting in, you know, in the environment. How do you see that sort of battle for the Southeast Asian tourist or the Northeast Asian tourist panning out? Because on the face of this, you know, again, sort of superficial, high level look at the numbers, there's not a big imbalance. You know, there's growth happening right across the board. I suppose the question is sort of, to what extent is this destinations actually pushing beyond? Have we worked out now what market it is we want, and is that growing for us? There was a lot in there, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, China is still the number one, isn't it? And I think destinations, you know, in the pandemic, we're all about, we want to diversify our destinations, and coming out of the pandemic, forgot about that quite quickly. And of course, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia all opened up visa-free access for China. China reciprocated, and we now have visa-free access to China for Thai, Singaporeans, and Malaysians. And that's working. I mean, and you can see there's a lot more secondary city to secondary city connections to China. So I think I just saw some Penang, Qingdao, or so there's lots of other connections facilitating travel into different parts of Malaysia other than just Kuala Lumpur, which I think is what's helping Malaysia out a lot. I mean, they have their Visit Malaysia year. And I was joking Gary Bowerman and I were joking the other day that every time Visit Malaysia declares a Visit Malaysia year, you better watch out, because the first one was 2020 and then the second one was 2026. So maybe not the best timing. I mean, they're still saying that they're targeting the ASEAN market, they're targeting China. But you can see that kind of paying off for Malaysia, looking at all of these secondary cities to East Malaysia to West Malaysia. And Singapore it's doing well, but I think that consumers are being put off. My impression is they're being put off by the high prices. And Malaysia just represents that good value for money, you know, if you compare on paper the two destinations. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's funny it's ironic what you say about Visit Malaysia year and all the rest of it, because poor old Tony Fernandez and his AirAsia X, you know, suddenly it was going to be, I'm coming back to London and guess what, I'm going via Bahrain. I mean, poor man must be thinking, why did I announce that? Because that's not going to happen soon.
No, but I think what's interesting is Vietjet, who they got that, was it Kazakh Air? I'm trying to remember the exact name now. And now they've just announced this new flight, Hanoi, Almaty, Prague. So I think that is kind of interesting. And I wonder if that might be a Vietnam use Central Asia as a transit hub to get to other places. Play that AirAsia perhaps wanted to imitate in Bahrain, but
maybe there should be a tag on the end of that says Prague brackets depending on headwinds close brackets, because that's what that's all about, I suspect.
We did say we were going to look at Central Asia in an upcoming webinar, so maybe that's the premise.
The fastest growing region in the world.
Yeah,
you know, it's a bit like London Southend. Mark will know this. London Southend yesterday came out and said it was the fastest growing airport in the United Kingdom last year. Yeah, guys, come on, you're starting from a base of 400,000 seats. You know, that's a bit like Central Asia, fastest growing off the smallest size.
Yeah. So looking ahead then, what it feels like there's, just notwithstanding the kind of current challenges, but it feels like there's optimism, certainly in your market, Mark, where the catch up is now about construction, isn't it? It's about infrastructure to enable growth. That's probably the biggest challenge, isn't it, in aviation?
It's about concrete, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, it literally, and it's all types. So it's not just you know whether it's expansion of the new Manila, it's road infrastructure, it's everything essentially. And I think I mentioned before, maybe mentioned before we started, but here is just one big infrastructure building site. There's construction going on all over the place. But yeah, that is I guess the short-term challenge.
And Hannah, what do you think? What do you think the biggest challenge? Again, sort of notwithstanding, who knows what's going to happen in the next 3 months, but what do you think the challenge is in the 2026 challenge for the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is diversifying those source markets, right? And I think that's the challenge. And yes, China's there. Countries are also swinging towards India, right? So they're making maneuvers there. But there are plenty of other markets that I think the region should be and could be capturing that perhaps aren't maximizing that right now.
Yeah. John?
I think the biggest challenge is careful management of the future capacity for 2026 and making sure that, many of these airlines that are growing capacity are not well placed in terms of fuel hedges. So they're vulnerable to the price of oil and even the supply of oil. And, not getting caught in that rush for capacity growth, and rather being a bit disciplined about it and making sure that they grow at a pace that's probably just below the market demand. Because if you do that, you're going to fill your aircraft. And if you do that, all things being equal, you're going to still be in business this time next year, which is what Mark wants from his airport and Hannah wants from the tourism industry.
Mm-hmm. Always comes back to capacity discipline in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, nothing like a bit of discipline.
On that note, we're out of time, unfortunately. So thanks, everybody, for participating. Thanks very much to our speakers, Mark and Hannah and John, as ever. It's been an interesting discussion this morning. For those of you listening, we will circulate a recording later on today, along with a slide deck. And if you don't already, please feel free to sign up to OAG's blog, where you'll be subject to regular pieces of insight along similar lines. And you can also get details there of upcoming webinars. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.